Jillian, let's begin with Stephen Bronfman himself. He is named, he is mentioned by name in these Paradise Papers. Who is he?
Well, he is probably the Bronfman that most Canadians have never heard of, Heather. He's always kept a very low profile as a businessman, a philanthropist, an environmentalist. But in 2013, he became a powerful player in Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party. It was a summer caucus retreat in PEI, and for the first time in a long time, Liberals were upbeat. A new charismatic leader, a new hope for power.
Well, across the country, people told me that we need better. And for the first time in a long time, people are open and hopeful about the Liberal Party of Canada.
Among those assembled was a man not much used to the campaigning part of politics, but a man the party would now rely on to raise the money it takes for campaigns to succeed.
You're gonna get some muscles.
Stephen Bronfman had just been named to the party's national board. With his good friend Justin by his side,
He's an old friend.
PEI marked his coming out as revenue chair.
Oh, the success will be whether or not we win the next election, which we will, and so that's how we gauge it. Money's a big part.
And money is what Bronfman brought in. $15 million in the year that followed, more than the party had seen in any year in a decade. Armed with that, Team Trudeau forged ahead.
Working hard on it, need your support.
Sweeping to victory, and the promise of defending middle-income Canadians, fair taxes for all. It's a promise Prime Minister Trudeau never fails to repeat.
We got elected on a promise to make sure that people were paying their fair shares of taxes.
Tax avoidance, tax evasion is something that we take very seriously.
The system we have right now encourages the wealthy to pay less tax.
That's not fair, and we're going to fix it.
So how to explain today's revelations in the Paradise Papers? A company headed by Justin Trudeau's hand-picked chief fundraiser, heavily involved in an offshore trust that may have cost Canadians millions in unpaid taxes. It's a 20-year trail of confidential memos and private records from two prominent Liberal families, exposing what tax experts say appear to be sham transactions, disguised payments, tax loopholes exploited at every turn.
When you see a pattern of intentional recharacterizations or mischaracterizations, I would say that there are lots of red flags, and I would expect tax authorities specifically to be very interested in following up.
The story begins in Montreal with the Bronfman family itself. Ensconced in the luxury of Westmount, generations have overseen a fortune built on distilling. Today, Stephen Bronfman runs a big part of the family empire, heading the investment company called Claridge. It is Claridge that's revealed in the Paradise leak as helping to set up an offshore trust in 1991 in the Cayman Islands. The trust was in the name of Kolber, Leo Kolber. He's Stephen Bronfman's godfather, used to run Claridge himself, and the two of them worked side by side for years. Kolber was as close to the Bronfmans as anyone could be, a surrogate son who jokingly called himself the family's consigliere, and who used his connections to raise millions for the Liberal Party of Canada. Private fundraisers at his own Westmount home, parties attended by Bronfmans and prime ministers alike. Kolber was very close to Pierre Trudeau, too. Yes, that's young Justin with him there. It was Trudeau Sr. who rewarded Kolber by appointing him to the Senate. And it was while Leo Kolber was sitting as a senator and running Claridge that he established his offshore trust. The trust may have been called Kolber, but according to the Paradise Papers, much of the money invested came from the Bronfmans. An initial $9.6 million loan from Stephen Bronfman's father, Charles. $5 million a few years later from Stephen himself, an interest-free loan that was repaid within months. Bronfman family trusts in the U.S. would contribute even more loans over the years, as would a Canadian numbered company linked to Claridge. Together, they would grow the value of the trust to more than $60 million US. All of it in a jurisdiction that charges no tax. So who was going to benefit from all that money? Senator Kolber's two children, Jonathan and Lynn, were named beneficiaries, meaning they were authorized to get disbursements from the trust. The documents show they made liberal use of that, especially Jonathan. Payments to him totaled $16 million over the years, some of them tagged simply for lifestyle expenses. But the trust had another purpose, too. The Bronfman empire was expanding into Israel. In 1991, after working for Claridge in Montreal, Jonathan moved to Israel to head up the family's efforts there. According to one document, for every dollar the Bronfmans invested in Israel, Jonathan's reward was a 15% share paid through the trust. This is how and why the trust was set up.
So you have described quite the elaborate structure there, Gillian, and I guess the first question I would have about offshore trusts is it legal?
Well, it was at the time, Heather, certainly legal in the Cayman Islands, where there would be no tax to pay, and it would be out of the reach of tax laws here, too, as long as everyone involved followed the rules. And as far as the Canada Revenue Agency was concerned, the fundamental rule was this. The trust really did have to be offshore, meaning that decisions about the money in the trust had to be made offshore by trustees.
So were the rules followed?
Well, lawyers for the trust insist to us that they were. What they call the management and control of the trust was always in the Cayman Islands, they say. But time and again, the Paradise Papers reveal decisions being made in Canada by people associated with that Bronfman company, Claridge. There are numerous references in the papers to meetings in Montreal, requests for approval back in Canada. When investment money moved into or out of the trust, it was often authorized by a Montreal investment advisor named Don Chazen. Chazen kept a second set of books for Jonathan Kolber in Montreal, we're told, and made the decisions.
If at the end of the day, the major decisions are taken here or taking place here, the mine management is in Canada, so the trust is a Canadian trust.
Marwo Rizki teaches tax law at the University of Sherbrooke. She's one of half a dozen tax experts our team turned to understand the materials we received. Those references to Montreal, she says, could be problematic.
Because if you see that the money comes from Montreal or from Canada, decisions are taking place in Canada. There's like too many things relating to Canada that will probably say, oh, hold on, is it a Canadian trust?
And if it was a Canadian trust, the CRA would want to know. The Montreal advisors seemed concerned about that, discussed reducing links to Canada, or at least the appearance of links. Take this memo. It's about an $81,000 fee to Don Chazen, that Montreal accountant. It quotes tax advisors for the Bronfmans and the Kolber family, suggesting the trust reallocate the fee by calling it a loan repayment instead to someone else. The result would be one less formal link to entities outside the Caymans.
That looks very suspicious.
Grayson McCooch of the University of Florida is another of the experts we consulted.
That looks deceptive on its face. It looks as if it was intended to mislead. It looks as if it was intended to conceal and to misrepresent the nature of the payment. So in fact,
and that wasn't the only thing McCooch found suspicious. Another involved those payments or disbursements to Leo Kolber's children, specifically his daughter Lynn, who lived in the United States. It became clear that even though Lynn had received money from the trust, she hadn't paid U.S. tax on it. So the advisors came up with a fix. She'd pay the back taxes, but going forward, they would remove her as a beneficiary, pay disbursements to Jonathan in Israel, and leave it to Jonathan to take care of Lynn by giving her gifts instead. Gifts between family members are not taxable in the United States.
I mean, these are coming from...
But were the payments really gifts, or, as McCooch wonders, simply disbursements in disguise?
Is there any other way, potential way, to look at this and not conclude that this was deception?
There's always the possibility of an innocent explanation. People have fertile minds. These are creative lawyers. Who knows what they might come up with, but the obvious explanation is that this was done to disguise or conceal or mislead.
The answers we got from Jonathan Kolber's lawyers about the gifts were confusing. In a first letter to the CBC, they said Jonathan did make gifts to his sister, but argued it wasn't tax evasion. 3 days later, we got a second letter in which they insisted Jonathan had made no gifts. But that wasn't the end of Jonathan's involvement. At another point, the issue was interest the trust was supposed to be paying on one of those U.S. loans from the Bronfman family. A series of faxes and emails marked confidential make it clear that Jonathan doesn't want to pay. And so there's another fix. Claridge advisors tell him they have to charge the interest, but they'll find a way to, quote, make him whole, perhaps by getting him to invoice Claridge for services rendered, equal to the interest paid.
It's very convenient to have services rendered for the exact amount of interest paying in the United States. Very convenient.
In their letter, Jonathan Kolber's lawyers were adamant no invoices were sent and nothing was paid. But a former Claridge executive told us Jonathan did start charging for his services. Indeed, in the margin of that email, someone has written, "done."
And maybe this just reconfirms...
When we showed all that to Marwa Rizki, she was shocked.
Well, that's a smoking gun right there. I mean, it's very bold to write it down.
If you have a trust with
It surprised Grayson McCooch, too.
If it's done solely to disguise or to reverse the purported interest payments, then again, it could look to an observer, particularly a revenue service, it could look like an evidence of fraudulent intent.
But what were the chances a revenue service was ever going to look, Heather? Don't forget, all of this was happening in secrecy.
Yeah, in secret. And we know the Cayman Islands had a long reputation of protecting the identities of people who invested there.
A very long reputation. As a matter of fact, for years, it was an actual crime in the Caymans for anyone to divulge any information about a client or an account, even to other tax authorities. By the late 90s in Canada, that kind of secrecy was starting to create friction. The battle was on to curtail offshore trusts and tax those who use them. But it would be a 13-year battle, Heather, and we will see the Bronfmans and their advisors were going to figure prominently. We all pay taxes, Heather, or at least we're supposed to. But if you're part of Canada's 0.1%, like the Bronfmans, you can probably afford a lot of help to help you exploit a tax system to your advantage. Lawyers, accountants, even government lobbyists. In 1996, there was a revelation that made all of that pretty clear.
It was, at the time, headline news.
Good evening. Revenue Canada took a hit today for a tax ruling that helped the rich in a big way. How big? More than $2 billion.
It was a secret ruling made 5 years earlier that no one would have known about if not for a nosy Auditor General.
We don't have a totally satisfactory explanation.
An explanation for why Revenue Canada allowed what at the time was an unnamed family to move $2 billion out of Canada to a U.S. trust, tax-free. The media soon identified the family as the Charles Bronfmans, Stephen Bronfman's father. The Auditor General identified a process that didn't smell right. Denis Desautels has never confirmed the name of the family, and he didn't to us, but he says what he discovered bothers him to this day. Officials at Revenue Canada initially refused to endorse the tax-free deal, he says, and were overturned after the family threatened to go over their heads.
There was enough pressure on Revenue Canada, I guess, to either pressure or, arguments, put to them, that in the end they made them sign off.
I mean, what did this say to you, the fact that this wealthy family and all the people representing it had that kind of access?
It's a red flag.
A red flag, perhaps, but the Bronfmans, Charles and his children, got what they wanted. And Canada was out an estimated $700 million in lost tax. That got people's attention. And soon the debate turned to what to do about tax avoidance, especially offshore.
A matter that has been studied to death.
For years, the debate dragged on, but by 2007, it seemed a consensus had finally emerged. The House of Commons was about to pass a bill cracking down on offshore trusts, taxing Canadians who contribute on their earnings.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you have to wonder why it's taking so long to close tax loopholes, to shut down tax havens, to deal with tax evaders, and to crack down on tax avoidance.
For the NDP's Judy Wassily-Chalice, who'd spent a decade pushing for tax reform, it was a hallelujah moment.
For me, it was an amazing period of time in life in Parliament, because it was actually a time when all parties came together on one issue, and that was to find a way to stop the spread and growth of these tax havens, and actually to put restrictions on them so we could see that money taxed in Canada. It was quite incredible. It was real hope.
But hope was about to run up against the Bronfmans and the rest of Canada's 0.1%. For the bill to become law, it now had to get through Parliament's upper chamber. And so it was to the Senate that the family's longtime law firm turned next, joining the campaign to have the bill scrapped.
No amount of tinkering can fix these rules because they are conceptually flawed.
The lawyers argued what was being proposed was too complicated, too unfair to those who invest offshore, not to mention those who help them.
The common man thinks that tax advisors, tax lawyers, and tax accountants spend their days looking for loopholes. Nothing could be further from the truth.
So they may not have been looking for loopholes, Heather, but it was a tax loophole that those lawyers found.
So I would imagine by that point, the Bronfmans and the Colbers had a lot of questions, had a lot of information about the proposed tax changes in Canada. Did you see any evidence of that in the Paradise Papers?
Yes, we did. We also saw worries about what their advisors called tax difficulties. And it wasn't just Canada that had the concern, but the U.S. and Israel, too. Tax reform was in the air everywhere. In Ottawa, lawyers were working hard to kill that bill in the Senate. But there was no guarantee they'd succeed. And so at that point, it seems, the advisors to the Colber Trust went looking for Plan B.
2 weeks after the bill got second reading in the Senate, down in the Caymans, another trust was set up. This one they called Lacombe. $23 million in assets that had been in the Colber Trust were then transferred to Lacombe. The Paradise Papers confirmed that much of the original money in Colber came from Canadians. Could they now claim that technically the money they transferred to Lacombe originated in the Caymans and not in Canada?
Presumably the view was that by transferring it from Trust 1 to Trust 2, formally they would be outside the new rules for this new trust.
Jeff Loomer teaches tax law at Dalhousie University.
Presumably that's the position, even though, obviously we can stand back and look at it from a...
Yeah.
But has the substance really changed? No, but that's how this game works.
And it's a game that, in the end, they didn't even have to play. The Colbers had their new trust. But back in Ottawa, that bill that the Bronfman law firm had been working to defeat got stalled in the Senate, dying when an election was called in 2008.
Some documents that have come into our
For Judy Wassily-Chalice, it was hard not to be cynical.
What we're really dealing with is almost like a legalized tax evasion. In other words, a system that is so embedded and so entrenched that every step of the way, the vested interests connected to these wealthy families and corporations rule the day.
So the bill died in 2008. Was that the end of Canada's efforts to legislate offshore trusts?
No, but it would take another 5 years before a version of that bill finally did become law, and then it was made retroactive to 2007. By then, a number of countries were cracking down on offshore trusts, including Israel. And for those associated with the Colbert and the Lacombe trusts, that was going to matter big time.
In 2014, Israel passed its own law, taxing Israelis who were beneficiaries of offshore trusts. Jonathan Colbert was the beneficiary of the Colbert and Lacombe trusts. For 15 years, he'd headed the Bronfman family business in Israel and was an Israeli citizen. At this point, according to the Paradise Papers, the decision was made to dissolve the trusts in the Caymans, move the assets to Israel, and as per the new law, have Jonathan negotiate a settlement with Israeli tax authorities. But what about the Canadian tax authorities? Did anyone tell them about the trusts? In their letter responding to our questions, lawyers for Jonathan Colbert said it was their understanding the Israeli application was not sent to anyone in Canada. There was no need. Neither the Colbert nor the Lacombe Trust was ever liable to Canadian taxation, according to their interpretation. But shouldn't that have been up to the CRA to decide? Under Canada's new tax law, contributions to offshore trusts could be liable for tax if they originated in Canada. So the question is, did they? There is a document in the Paradise leak that seems to confirm they did. It's a draft of Jonathan's settlement with Israel in 2015. Buried in it, one line in particular. The source of the trust assets, he says, was his father, who is a resident of Canada.
So it seems to me he's saying there, yeah, the money came from Canada originally. The contributions were Canadian.
Yep. And if that's true, and we've no reason to doubt that it's true, and if that's true, then I think the CRA would be interested to see that statement.
So, Gillian, as we heard, you asked Colbert's lawyers if anyone had told the CRA about those Canadian contributions, and their answer was no?
That's what they said, Heather, and there's a lot that they didn't say as well. For instance, why Senator Colbert was cited as the source of the funds in 2015 when the Paradise Papers show so many of the original loans coming from the Bronfmans. The lawyers insist their clients have always acted properly, ethically, and in full compliance with the law. Any assertion to the contrary, they say, specifically any suggestion of false documentation, disguised conduct, fraud, or tax evasion is false.
Well, what about all those experts you consulted? Did they come to any conclusion?
No, what they all say, which is true, at the end of the day, is going to be for the CRA to sort that out. What they think the central issue could be, though, is that fundamental question we talked about earlier. Was the trust really offshore? Because if it wasn't, in effect a Canadian trust being managed in Montreal, then earnings were, at the very least, reportable to the CRA, which would then have to come to its own conclusions about what tax, if any, might be owed.
You started this story, Gillian, telling us about Stephen Bronfman. As you've reported, he loaned money to the Colbert Trust. He heads the company that helped set it up. He's also the Liberal Party's revenue chair. Did you get any answers from him?
We tried, Heather, but Mr. Bronfman has not returned any of our calls or emails. We then asked the Prime Minister's office what they thought, and they referred us to the Liberal Party. And in a statement, the party told us that Stephen Bronfman sits on the National Board as a volunteer, supporting fundraising and not policy decisions.
Gillian, thank you very much.
Thank you.